going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast where we look at ideas and concepts from Bowen family systems theory and present them as clearly as we can, starting with an elevator pitch. Today we're looking at the idea of relationship triangles. My name is Dixie Vandersloos. I am a counselor and a member of the faculty at Living Systems. Katie White is joining me each episode. Katie is a couple and family therapist and also the executive director of Living Systems in Vancouver. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Dixie. Happy to be here.
And joining us from Australia is Dr. Jenny Brown. Jenny has worked in child and family mental health and family therapy for about 4 decades. She's been a trainer, supervisor, author, and researcher. She's the Emeritus Executive Director of the Family Systems Institute, Sydney, and currently directs the Family Systems Practice and the Parent Hope Project. Among her many published works are the best-selling book, Growing Yourself Up, and a new book, Facilitating Parent Agency in Child and Adolescent Mental Health, From Helplessness to Hope. And I appreciate the inclusion of the word hope there, Jenny, and a bunch of the things that you do. So I'm really glad that you're joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Dixie. Good to be with you.
Yeah. Well, I remember very clearly the day when a counselor described a relationship triangle to me, and I had never heard of it before, but it immediately made sense. And I've seen that sort of light bulb moment in clients that I've worked with. So does someone want to begin with your elevator pitch of what is a triangle?
Well, I'll jump in as the one from down under with my, I'm going to be really brief with it. Here it is. Okay. A triangle is a detour from addressing issues from the relationships they belong in. So there's my short elevator pitch. It is, and like all of these concepts from Bowen in his theory around relationships, it's a way of calming things down. It stabilizes things.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to unpacking that more, Dixie, but just the key. It's driven by just avoiding dealing with things in the two-person system that they belong in.
Perfect. Katie, what about you?
Short and sweet. I have a little short and sweet, and then I can expand too. I said, I think triangles are ways in which relationships organize themselves. So it's a recognition that all beings in nature, today we'll probably talk mostly about humans, are interacting with each other at all times in a dynamic way. And I think that to me is the short piece of what a triangle means, what an emotion and relationship triangle means. And I think if we want to get into, which I'm sure we will, there's different ways that people can be in a triangle, but that two-person system can invite people into their triangle. Other people like myself, who was a born therapist, can invite themselves into, a twosome. But I think at the heart of it, it really is the way that systems regulate themselves, and I wanted to make sure, I know we're going to talk a little bit about interlocking triangles, but I wanted to place the visual in people's head of how these web out. So it's not just this 3-person system and that's all. That 3-person system will invite other people. And so this becomes a very, a web of interlocking triangles.
Mm-hmm. Well, I might have the longest pitch of everyone today. Mine was, a triangle is any 3 people who have a relationship. The concept of triangles highlights how much easier it is to talk about someone than to someone. When there is tension between 2 people, it's automatic to bring in a third person through gossip or blame or helping. This may not solve the problem between the 2 people, but it can make those 2 feel better because it spreads the tension between 3 instead of 2. And that math may work in the short term, but possibly not in the long term. And then from Dr. Bowen, the theory states that the triangle, a three-person emotional configuration, is the molecule or the basic building block of any emotional system, whether it is in the family or any other group. The triangle is the smallest stable relationship system. A two-person system may be stable as long as it's calm, but when anxiety increases, it immediately involves the most vulnerable other person to become a triangle. When the tension in the triangle is too great for the threesome, it involves others to become a series of interlocking triangles. I used to call them like octagons, but it really is all of these three-person relationships kind of interconnecting.
I think, Dixie, what I want to make sure that we put in here, like really early on, is that triangles are not good or bad. I think sometimes they can get a rap as like we're saying that they're bad, they're used in this way. But I think I really just want to emphasize that triangles just are. This is just a way that a system organizes itself. And sometimes, like you said, in the short term, or maybe even in the long term, they're useful to a system. And sometimes they can be less useful, but they exist. So not to put that good or bad on them.
Yeah. What stood out for you, Jenny, in terms of all of the different definitions?
Yeah, well, on the surface, triangles sound really simple, right? The three-person system. Everyone recognizes the detours of gossip, one of the most kind of common things, or taking sides against another. But there's so much more nuanced than that, aren't they? And I would say that it's really important for people to hear these concepts, have some recognition intellectually, but you've got to do the work in your real life relationships to see the many variations of triangles. And it's a lifelong effort rather than something you can learn in a 1-week seminar. But I've thought about triangles just to try and capture some of the nuances. I've got my 4 ways of triangling, and of course it's not exhaustive, but it might just introduce people to the different variations of the detouring of triangles. The first one is the one that's most recognized, which is side taking. That we have an issue with one person and we go and complain about them to a third party who takes our side. And there are many versions of side taking. And we might talk about this later, but for the counselors out there, the invitation to take sides with your client's story can create a pseudo engagement, but not one that is growth producing for the client. So side taking's one. The second one I've called project making. So rather than 2 people keep working on their person-to-person relationship, they make a project out of a third party. And the most common one would be a child, that we join together and put all of our relationship focus on the child that we're worried about or over invested in. But of course, you can do that in the workplace, make a project out of helping another. And the third one I've got is, I've called it combating, which is an unwilling outsider in a triangle trying to get into the twosome. And then the fourth one is the opting out, which is a willing outsider, like get me out of here. And just how that activates the intensity of the triangle as well. And each of the 3 people involved are active participants in the triangle, even the child. I mean, not consciously active, but yeah, we're all 33 point whatever % active in keeping that triangle going. So there's a few different versions of triangles that I thought about.
Thanks, Jenny.
That's
I
great.
always appreciate the visual. Like when I hear you describing those, I'm imagining people in my life, or myself in the way that I'm involved. So thinking through where those show up.
And that inside position when you're, how does it go when life is good? Do you want to be on the inside with the other person, and then when the stress picks up, it can be a little more comfortable to to get out. And like we were
Yes.
talking about distance last time. Yeah. Examples? Should we go right into some examples?
I was excited for this episode and having Jenny on it because I think that it's my opportunity to thank her for my reintroduction to Bowen theory. When I was living in Sydney, Australia, she was consulting with the organization I was working with, and we were talking about a situation I was up against, and she explained the concept of a triangle, how, my inviting myself as the good older sister, that I can often invite myself into other people's conflicts, and to really think through how that was showing up in myself and how it was showing up in the system. And it was literally, as they say, those light bulb moments where I thought, oh my goodness, I can think about this differently. I can think about what I can do in this situation differently, where I felt very powerless at, starting a job and not knowing how to position myself in it. So I thought, triangles to me, really in the workplace and my own family, although I will say something later about struggling to see them sometimes, has been so useful. So my opportunity to thank Jenny for talking to me about a triangle.
Well, Katie, I have to say that one of the contexts that has taught me most about the challenge of triangling invitations is coming in to consult and other organizations. And I sit down with a team and start to hear all of their complaints about management or how the organization is changing and they don't like it. And it's like, what do I do? This is a triangle invitation. How can I be a useful resource for people's work on themselves rather than just a detouring space? So I remember early on when I was invited into that, just coming up with the key question, how are you dealing with that issue with your manager? How's that going? When's the last time you talked to them about it? And I do the same in clinical work. When people have a complaint, rather than create a platform for making a case against another, to be really interested in how that person is expressing and dealing with that issue in the relationship it belongs in. And very often you hear, well, I'm not talking to them about it and they won't listen. And that's interesting. And you don't go telling them what to do. You just unpack what they have done to try to represent themselves in the relationship where the issue belongs. So they're everywhere, as you say, Katie. There are many examples in clinical work, in supervising, and of course in our own families.
Yeah. I've been thinking about, sometimes I describe it as like when I have a day and I just sort of vent to my husband, and it's like a release valve of my bitterness or my complaints, and it feels so good. And and it, I don't know, and I guess it's that in how frequent, how intense is the topic that I'm talking to him about instead of the other person. But there's something about it that just feels good. I don't know.
It's calming. It sure is. I'm very aware of those everyday triangling conversations about a third party. And I try to, not always successfully, make sure that my comment is acknowledging the challenge the other person is having in the relationship, but saying something truthful and compassionate about the person they're struggling with. In terms of just not going into the side taking or the blaming or the pathologizing. I'm not doing that as a technique. I'm doing that because I really believe it, that people are in a system and it's not the individual that is the problem. So, but I'll also say that in my marriage, when my husband would complain about things at work, it's just so easy because you're not part of that system directly to just let somebody vent. And as I was working more and more on what does differentiation, what does growing myself up look like in my relationship, I stopped doing that and changed it to asking about the relationship and what went on and how did he handle it, and just being genuinely curious about it. But I have to say, he hated it. And that's the other thing, when people are used to a particular pattern in a relationship, he stopped talking to me about his work for a while because he just didn't want the loss of that old triangle. And so it's always a journey, and there's always a change back when we start to adjust ourselves. But I want to balance this out. It's not just me de-triangling with others' invitations. I'll give some examples later of my own problematic entanglement in triangles. I can be quite active in them.
Did you want to add something, Katie?
I was going to add a thing that I found a good quote that Teitelman wrote in his book in 2008. I think it was the Triangles book, but I'll check it, because I think a triangle is what we're talking about when we're working as a therapist, and what's different about that. And, he wrote, the basic principle in Bowen theoretical therapeutic system is that the emotional issue between two people will automatically resolve if they are able to remain in contact with a third person who is free from the intensity of the emotional field between them, while at the same time actively engaging with each of them. And it made me think about what you were talking about, Jenny, with thinking about asking questions about the relationship versus talking with that one person about the other person. And I think that is the challenge of therapy, couples therapy specifically.
Yes. And we live those challenges in our family as well, don't we? When a sibling calls up to talk about another.
Yeah.
Yes, what do we do with that without distancing or cutting off? When I first discovered Bowen theory, and I'd been living overseas, I discovered the theory in my time working and living in the US, and then I come back to Australia. And I just had this rule for myself that if any of my family were talking about another family member, I would just say, oh, I'm not going to talk about that. Let's talk just about us. And it was really jarring and unhelpful. And it was this idea that I could by just not talking about another, that was not being in a triangle. And it just reminds me just how this is trial and error over life. And I learned from that. And I thought, that's not being present in a relationship. I have to find a different way of being able to talk about the third party. So, for example, I will now apply this principle that when I talk about a third party, I must not say anything that I wouldn't say if that third party was standing in the corner of the room and listening to me.
Right.
And that, so we can talk about people, but neutrally and respectfully and objectively, not with an emotional charge of any kind of side taking or going into territory that doesn't belong to us.
Yeah.
So it's such a big topic, the triangle one, and you learn it by living it. You read about it, you hear about it from your therapist, but you've got to experiment and live it and observe it to really get the usefulness of working to stay out of triangles.
Yeah.
And to notice them, because they are inevitable, of course, to notice the triangles that are just part of everyday conversation.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, Jenny.
I was going to say the idea that when I do sort of default into I'm about to vent my bitterness or pull in someone, it's a cue for me that my anxiety is up, and using it to course correct. And I think that's one of the most useful things about these 4 patterns of handling relationships that Dr. Bowen came up with is when I can see it, I can work on it versus
which is my segue that I just still, after working, over 10 years in Bowen theory, I'm just always surprised by how often I cannot see it in my own family. I can look at a clinical family where I'm neutrally outside of and think about the triangles and observe them. I do much better in a work system. Well, sometimes I can get a good question by a coach of, what do you think it is that's getting you so worked up about that topic? Which is a useful question to think about triangles. Like you said, Dixie, why am I, how am I thinking about this? What is happening for me? But in my family, man, I just can't sometimes see those interlocking triangles that are showing up in the relationship that I'm in. And I think, what is this about? What's making this person come at me in this way? And so I just wanted to put that question in there because I just think they are, for me at least, in my own family work, sometimes really hard to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is useful to have a coach who's trained in Bowen theory, has been working on it for a long time, because these are hard things. We can get an introduction through reading a book, but it's not enough, is it? And can I give an example from just how a coach helped me in a really tricky transition in my family life where I could see a triangle, but I couldn't see my part in it clearly. I needed a coach to ask the questions, to map it out for me to be able to work it out. And it was a time when an elder daughter had moved out of home and the younger daughter was kind of the only child left, which is intense. And there's an adjustment in a family. There's always more stress when there's a family transition. And I experienced a real discomfort about the alliance developing at the dinner table between my husband and my daughter. I really felt on the outside. I felt her jump to my husband's defense when I didn't think it was necessary. And it was really stirring me up and I couldn't figure it out. And I was as happens with us, I got very focused on the other and not on what am I not addressing myself and which relationship. This is the key question for me. Which relationship have I not addressed being a self in? And of course, in this triangle, it's between me and my husband. And the things that we haven't worked through is where moving through a stressful transition of a change of the dynamic at home and what each of us are experiencing. But really interesting, in coaching, I got to see that I was the combative, in a polite way, trying to get in to the two of them, which of course pushes the two closer together with that emotional posturing of let me in here and let me get you closer to me on this, especially my daughter. And when I saw that that was keeping the triangle alive and that it was a whole lot better to celebrate the two of them being there for each other and to be really interested. They had a joint interest in music and going to live music, and rather than feel left out, to just be really celebrating what was being generated between father and daughter and to be interested in it, and took the heat out of it. And of course, there's more complexity to it, but it was a real turning point example for me. I needed a coach to help me work that one through. I don't think I could have gotten objective enough on my own. And of course, in my family of origin, what am I most sensitive to? Being an outsider, because my steadying position was my very strong alliance with my mother. So, I've deliberately worked and still need to do it at being a comfortable outsider and celebrating others taking the stage and not needing to be on it with them. So I hope that example is useful.
So useful.
Yeah, it's interesting. actually at that exact stage with the last child moving out in a couple weeks actually now. But and we have three, two are already in university, and I remember noticing that my husband maybe is not as connected as I think he ought to be with his now adult children. And it was I could see what I wanted to do to draw him to these other relationships. And then I'm like, that's none of my business, you know? And so I just asked him one day, what's your plan for having a relationship with these kids as they grow up? And it sort of floored him, because that's way more curious than Dixie's usual posture of what's wrong with you. So, but yeah, noticing that those inside outside positions, and
Dixie,
what do we do
think, or
differently?
Jenny, maybe like, but the question that comes up for me that might be useful to people who are listening is, what do you think are resources or ideas that go into being able to see that? Maybe I'm asking secretly for myself. Like, what is a useful suggestion to help people see triangles in their system?
Yeah, looking for the magic. The magic of learning to see triangles, Katie. One day someone might find the easy answer to that question. My favorite question is sort of the one I started with, which is, if there is any sense of discomfort for me with another person or two other people, is which is the relationship where I'm not being a self in? Where have I stopped being in a person-to-person relationship? In my example, it was clearly with my husband. It wasn't, I was trying to get on the inside again with my daughter, but the issue, the place where my immaturity had given me the escape route to focus on being close to my daughter and not keep working on being a self with my husband. So it's just, where do the issues belong? What haven't I addressed in the primary relationship here that has escaped to the third party? I don't know if that's helpful. Maybe, Dixie, you've got a few ideas.
The thing that came to mind for me was, if you draw a triangle and put whoever you want, a partner and a child is great, right? And then what I love about the 4 patterns in Bowen theory is that they all fit on a triangle. And then you add when the tension picks up, do I go to my mother? Do I go to my best friend? Like, you can add the other triangles, but it's a way to observe who's getting close, who's getting distant, who's over and under functioning, which we're going to talk about, I think, next episode. But for me, it's been helpful, and I've done some of this in some of my research, is looking at those a triangle and the patterns around the triangle when it's calm, and then when it gets a little worked up, and then when we're all sort of, or one of us is sort of done in, and how does it look different? And then on a good day, I'm like, I see it in me, and I start to shift things in me. On a bad day, I say, what's wrong with all you people? And I tell them what to do, or crawl into bed with a bowl of chips. But but that's for me. Yeah,
thinking through over time, you're saying, kind of watching that variation in the way the triangles look over time,
and the visual of it, right? I think can be, So my takeaway was, if you draw a triangle and you see what happens, who moves, how, what, when, where, right? It's simple, maybe to observe, take some practice, but it's a simple idea anyways.
Yeah, the value of observing. And we talk a lot in Bowen theory about the work is on self, which is true, but it's always self in the system. So one eye on self, one eye on what's going on in the system, and just observing the two is useful. And in terms of opening up the nuances of triangles, I'm glad, Dixie, that you, or maybe Katie, you said this, just that there are times when things are calm where the triangle lies dormant, like desert flowers. You know, you can't see them. And then down comes the rain stress and out they pop. And that's really interesting to be aware of as well, I think. Just the interplay of stress on activating triangles that might take us by surprise, but they've already been there, and they've moved across generations often, and they're waiting to pop up. The predictable pattern of who rushes in to side with the vulnerable person and who gets blamed on the outside, and all of those things can be quite predictable.
Yes. I appreciate the gift of being one of three siblings. And I think I get this gift of observing how triangles function in that natural three growing up, and how we go back to predictable patterns when there's variability in it, how the interlocking triangles have shifted some of this. I was really interested in some of the shifts when children came on the scene in the next generation, and how it just moves things around. And they're fun to watch.
Yeah, so much of my work focus at the moment is helping parents see their part in the intensity that can get in the way of their child being able to have breathing space to be their best. And triangles are such a big part of that. So the real common triangles, as I'm sitting with parents and mapping out their interaction patterns with the child and the other parent, is the triangle of one parent more on the outside, watching the parent on the inside with the child and reacting to that parent with an opposite position that is often critical of the parent, either silently critical or openly critical. And it's just so predictable. And parents need to be able to express to each other their thinking and their differences about how they're wanting to go about managing a situation with a child. But triangles are not mature conversations. In being parents being a resource, they are an anxious reaction to seeing the other parent struggle with the child or the child not doing well. So and just helping parents to see that. One of the key ideas is, where is your energy direction going in this interaction? Is it going into trying to manage your child, reacting to your parenting partner, or managing yourself and what's in your control? And those questions are very deliberately opening up the triangles for parents who are doing this work.
Jenny, I really have appreciated Parent Hope. I had an example when you were describing that come to my mind, where I was thinking about, I live away from both grandparents of my child, and I was watching myself. We talk on FaceTime, as you know, you have to do with international parents. And I was watching the intensity. I was getting frustrated with my child because she wasn't paying attention to her grandparent who was talking and I just was watching how I was moving towards her and telling her to stop doing what she was doing. She needs to be focusing on the grandparents. And just to have a reference of stepping back and being curious and just getting interested in their relationship and how they're working on it, and looking at the facts that they connect every week. They have, and just being curious of where my anxiety to push on that relationship was coming from.
Yeah, it's a great example of how quickly we move into the project making triangle pattern, making a project out of another.
Yeah.
It never goes too well.
No, it did not. So thank you for the resource of the Parent Hope Project and my own thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, any other final thoughts? I mean, so much to say.
I had a takeaway suggestion.
Yeah.
I think I talked quite a bit about Harriet Lerner the last time we were together, but I was thinking about, I was rereading her first book, I believe it was The Dance of Anger. And I was going to point people to, she has a section in the back of that book that she calls Tasks for the Daring, which I just appreciated because I do think sometimes this work on self takes some bravery. It takes some ability to, make those risks. And I just wanted to point people in that direction. If it's a book that's probably now, I think it's from the early 80s. So thinking about, there you go, Dixie's got it on the shelf. But so to think about, there were just so many good suggestions about things you can do on triangles. Observing is always in there, planning ahead on the action you're going to take, talking with the person you're upset with, and not everyone, many of the things that we talked about here. But I just really appreciated that little segment. So if someone wants a takeaway, I think just pulling up that book and looking at those tasks for the daring.
Yeah. I'm really glad that there have been some more books beyond Harriet Lerner. She was, that book was my first intro to Bowen theory, but I didn't even know it was Bowen theory at the time. And then to the value of Roberta Gilbert's books and what Kathleen Smith is now doing in accessible books, and my own effort with growing yourself up. But I would also say to people to not just stick at that level. These books are good intro books, and to really grapple with some of Bowen's actual writing just brings the depth of it to life. And I'd encourage people listening to look at ways they can take their entree level, although entree in the US is main course. In Australia, it's our starter. So I better reframe that.
Right.
Appetizers.
Starter level, your appetizer, that there's great value in going deeper at which courses such as what you offer at Living Systems and what the Family Systems Institute and the Bowen Network programs offer. And you don't have to be therapists to gain benefit from the course offerings.
Yeah.
And I think with this, a topic as complex as triangles, simple on one level, but complex as you try and live it out and observe it in life, I would like to leave people thinking about taking a deeper dive into their learning using a network center to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And
there's
that. So many that offer for congregational work and for in business. And I mean, besides the family, of course, which would be in all of it. But yeah, that's great, Jenny. We can put up some links.
Yeah, I also put a link on hearing Dr. Bowen talk about this in his basic tape. So on the Bowen Center, his basic series, tape 1 has a really good segment of Dr. Bowen himself talking about triangles. And I've used that before in my teaching.
Yeah. It's not that we're putting Bowen up there as some leader for us to be disciples to. He would hate that. That's not being a grown-up. He is a theorist, a researcher. He's put years into observing the human in families and embedding it in natural systems. So it's promoting the theory, not following this person. Right. I just want to clarify that.
It's a good point to clarify. Yeah. And what, and doing the work, which I think is what we've all really talked about today.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for taking the time to be here. And like you said, triangles are a huge part of the work you do with the Bear and Hope Project. And so thank you.
Thank you, Dixie and Katie. A pleasure to be with you.
Good.
You too.
Well, and thanks everyone for listening today. And I hope that this has stirred some of your own thinking and that you can take it out, maybe observe some triangles as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.